Hi, I'm Ben. I'm an instructor at Ontologize, and we're going to build a workshop module today that implements something called conditional visibility to control the look and feel and even the security of our module. At the end of this tutorial, you'll feel comfortable using various ways to control the visibility of widgets, sections, and even ontology data inside of your workshop module. Before we get too far, however, a word from our founder.
Discover how Palantir customers unlock more value from Foundry and AIP thanks to our live instructor-led trainings. We are Ontologize, a group of former Palantir engineers who love teaching. We've trained thousands of Palantir users at leading organizations around the world. Unlock the full potential of your Palantir deployment by going to ontologize.com.
Let's take a look at what we're going to be building together. So I have a workshop module here, and I'm looking at this from the perspective of an administrative user. And we'll also look at this from the point of view of a non-administrative user. This will be critical for us later. It has an inbox style feel to it. There's filters on the left. We have a table of notional employees. We're going to be generating all of this data inside of Pipeline Builder. It looks like there's a XY chart down below. In this case, it's a bar chart or histogram of countries of the selected employees. If I deselect the employees up top, that chart goes away. So I am conditionally controlling the visibility of this section based on the selection in the table above. Next, I've got a button. It looks like it's some sort of action button here where I can select an employee in the table and then edit the record for that employee. However, I'm told you have to be an administrator, which I am, and it has to be Friday. And much to my chagrin, today is not Friday. So I can't actually take this action. So that's number 2. Number 3, I'm going to call out here that I have access to salary information for these employees because I belong to an administrators group. Now, what I'm going to do at this point is pivot over to look at this same module from the point of view of my colleague, Bob, who is not part of that administrators group. Okay, here I am as Bob. I have the same functionality with the graph down below in that section. However, I don't have that button and I don't have that salary column. Now, all of that is being controlled using conditional visibility. When we get to the setup here, we'll talk very intently about how we actually configure that. For now, let's talk about what we're going to do in this tutorial together. Number 1, we're going to go over to Pipeline Builder and we're going to generate this notional data for employees. We're then going to synchronize that to the ontology. In the ontology manager, we will configure an action to modify employees. Then we'll come over to our workshop module and we'll configure the basics. And then we'll move on to adding the conditional visibility elements. Let's head over to Pipeline Builder and get started. I'm inside a project where I have the editor role. I have a folder structure set up. Not required that you do this exactly how I've done it here, but just a way that I can organize the data and then the applications we're generating here. I'm going to step into the data folder, and wherever you are, what we want to do here is we want to create a pipeline builder artifact. And I'm going to call this my employee generator. And the way that we're going to get data into this pipeline builder is to manually enter the data. So I'm going to choose that option to manually enter data. And we're going to give this a schema with 5 columns. Column number 1 is going to be ID. And then we'll have name. Let's have role, country, and finally salary. Now, all these are going to be strings except for the final one. The way that we adjust the schema in manually enter data is by clicking the icon just to the left of the column name here. So instead of a string, we'll change this to an integer. And now what I'd like to do is choose notion or generate notional data here. I don't need to apply yet. We're going to generate notional data. And now there's an interface for us to generate notional data for each one of these columns. For ID and name, we're going to leave the defaults. For the role, what I'd like to do here, just so we get some variation in the data, is we're going to choose list. And it doesn't really matter that we get the exact same roles here, but I'm going to put roles like analyst and developer and data scientist and HR manager And we will leave it at that. So 4 distinct role types here, and we're going to give them a weight so that we get a little bit of variation. Let's come down and do the same thing with country. So instead of just auto-populating with a country code here, we're going to choose a list, and we'll enter a few countries here. So maybe CA, CN, FR, DE, US, UK. And then likewise, we'll give them some weights. And we get some variation. For salary, what I'm going to do is, we don't want a constant value. We're going to set a range here, and that range is going to be between 100,000 to 300,000. We'll click generate. Our data looks okay. Let's hit apply and close. If we wanted to check in on the distribution of those values, we could, for example, choose role and view the stats on that column, and we should see it's not evenly distributed throughout all 50 employees that have been created here. So the data is a bit more interesting than that. Once we have that all set, we can add an output here from our manually entered table. And the output type we're going to choose is going to be an object type. Let's call this object type something very deliberate. I'm going to call it my first initial last name with dash tutorial enclosed in brackets, and then we'll call it employee. I'm going to update the icon. Okay, I'm also going to toggle the option to allow edits to this object. We'll want that so that we can put some actions in place. I see that the ID is currently set to be the primary key property and the title property. I'd rather have the name be the title property here. So I'm going to click the dots of ellipsis out to the right of that property, and I'm going to set it as the title property. That all looks great. I'm going to hit save, and then I'll need to hit deploy twice. First, to bring up the deployment window on the right side, and second, to actually deploy the pipeline. Now remember, in Pipeline Builder, deploy is the word for build. So it'll be building the data set to back our ontology object type. It will also kick off the process of synchronizing that data into the ontology storage service, where it'll be ready for us to start building with. So I'm going to click deploy, and then we're going to wait a couple minutes for that whole process to run. Okay, it's been a couple minutes. Pipeline Builder tells me the deployment's up to date. That means the data set successfully built. I've given it a few extra minutes to synchronize to the ontology storage service. So I can validate that that process is complete by right-clicking on my node, and we can just open it directly in the ontology manager. Let's go take a look. The way that I'll know that the indexing and synchronization process has completed is that I get 50 objects that show up here in the upper left. Otherwise, I'll get a spinning wheel letting me know that that process is still running. In the data sources tab, I can scroll down and watch that process run here. For now, everything looks fine. The properties look great. Everything has been synchronized correctly. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to add an action type. Now, before I configure an action type here, I want to talk about a special user group that I created to represent administrators in this notional platform. If I head down to the settings in the bottom left, click my initials and click the settings button, I'm taken to a page that lists the groups that I have the ability to manage. One of them that I see in here is called Example Admin Group. I just created this group, and I placed myself and only myself inside of this group. Notably, my notional colleague Bob is not a member of this Example Admin Group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an action type, and only members of that admin group are going to be able to execute this action in any of the front-end ontology compatible applications in Foundry. By the way, if you don't have the ability to create a group, not to worry, I'll show you what to do instead. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new action here. It's going to be a modify objects action. And let's just put a couple in here. Let's say we can modify the country and the name. We'll click next. I'm going to deliberately name this just like I did the object type here. First initial, last name, dash, tutorial. And we'll call this edit employee record. Okay, we're now to the security and submission criteria. What group or user or org should be able to execute this action? If you're able to set up your own separate test admin group, then find that group here. If you're not, what I suggest is finding a group that you do have membership in and placing that in here. You'll also want to copy that down somewhere else because we'll want to retain that group name, or more specifically, the RID or resource ID for that group. Let me show you how to do that really quickly here. I'm going to come down to the bottom left of the screen, click on your initials, and then click on your name specifically. So for me, Ben Thomas, I'm going to be taken to my record in the settings. What I want is a list of groups that I belong to. You'll find it over here on the right side of the screen. One thing you can do that's kind of interesting is choose View Access in Graph. This is going to throw your user onto a generic graph. We can right-click on it and view all groups, and we get a visual representation of all the groups that you are a member of. So I have my example admin group that I created. I also have another user group here that's just called Ontologize Tutorials Creation. And so find a group that you have access to, that you're a member of, right-click, and you're going to copy the node ID. Okay, and when you copy that node ID, we can head back over to the Ontology Manager, and we can actually search for it using that ID. Paste that in, it will come up by name. Okay, or you can search for it by name. So for me, for example, I'm looking for my admin group, example admin group, and we'll go ahead and click Create. No additional configuration needed. We'll click Save. And save to the ontology. Okay, we're all done creating our data. We generated some notional data in Pipeline Builder. We synchronized it to the ontology. We created an action type. We controlled the execution of that action type, limited the execution to a specific group, and now we're ready to go and start building in Workshop. I'm back in my project where I've got my editor role, and I'm going to head into this folder called Applications that I've created. And we just need to create a new Workshop module. Let's first give this a name. Let's call this our Employee Hub. And we'll also name our module the same thing. So we're going to click into the header, and I'm just going to grab that title. And with the module header selected, I can enter Employee Record Hub here, and might as well give it a better logo. Person logo, maybe a different color. Okay, on the left side, we're going to have a filter. On the right side, we're going to have two parts to the module. We're going to have a table on the top, and we're going to have a graphical visualization of some of the data on the bottom. We'll end up in the upper right part of the second section on the right. We'll put a action button. We're going to configure all that, and then we will add in the conditional visibility elements. So let's start by creating a variable that will represent the set of all the employees that we just created. So we'll create a variable here. It's going to be an object set definition, and we'll call this all employees. And I named my object type something very specific to make it easy to search for. There are the employees. We'll select, make sure that we have some values here that we'd expect. 50, that checks out. So on the left side, let's start by naming our section. So right now the section name is simply section. I'm going to let you know how I like to label sections and widgets so that they appear nicely in the table of contents. I like to keep the type of artifact that it is, if it's a section, if it's a widget. So I'll have section : I'm going to call this our filters. Now notice that's not the name of the section, but it is the name of the section in the table of contents. Okay. So I will name the section though. Let's call this filters. And I'm also going to change the style from a subheader to a header title. And we'll give it an icon here, filter icon. It's a common one for a filter section. And let's give it a unique color as well. We'll make it green. Now let's add in our filter list widget. Filter list widget selected in the middle part of the screen, and its configuration panel opens on the right. Before I even get into configuring it, I'm going to rename it filter list 1. We'll call this filter list employees. That just helps keep things better organized in our table of contents on the left side of the screen. Object set going in here is going to be all employees. Now let's pick a few fields, a few properties from this object type. Let's have country, Maybe we'll want the role as well. Maybe we want the salary down below in kind of a distribution. This looks okay. For country, there's a lot of values here. So maybe I'll change that from a histogram to a multi-select dropdown. We have a limited number of roles. The histogram view might be fine here. So that might be all right to start with here for filters. So remember, our filter list widget also has an output variable. It's generically named filter list one filter output. Now, filters are a unique data type in Workshop. So the filter list widget doesn't output an object set. It outputs a filter that we then need to use somewhere else. So I'm going to click into the filter output name here. Let's rename it from filter list one. I'm going to call this filter : employees. We're going to use a filtered set of employees. And so let's create an object set that represents a filtered series of employees. So new object set definition. And we'll call this filtered employees. Our starting object set will still be all employees, but we're going to filter using that filter variable here. Okay. So we're ready to use that. Now on the right side, I would like this section to be in a row orientation. The overall orientation for the page, notice, is columnar. But what I'd like for this section to be is row-based, so that I can put a table up top in the first row and then a section down below that holds an XY chart or a bar chart on the bottom. So we're going to set our layout here to be rows. And the way we'll get these to be equal size is our top section here. Let's change that to a flex. So we have a 1-to-1 flex relationship here. And then I'm going to give each of these sections its own header. All right, so header here, and we'll add another header below. And then I'm going to remove the containing sections header here. So we're just left with those two. So we can see how that looks in the table of contents. We have a section that contains our two sections. Let's configure the look and feel of these sections while we're here. I'm going to call this section employee table, and we'll give it a different header title style. Let's give it a person icon. Maybe give it a little coloring as well. We'll use orange. Let's do the one down below too. Now down below, we're going to put a chart. So we can just generically call this chart, and call this chart. We can also give it a chart icon. And for coloring, I'm going to give this red. And let's also change the header style. Okay, so we're approaching the look and feel that we want. I'm going to save and publish. What we need to do now is put an object table up top that represents the filtered set of employees. So let's add a widget. The widget we're going to add is an object table, and the input data for that is going to be the filtered employees. I'm going to rename the object table from the generically named object table 1 to object table employees. Let's add in all the properties, and we can remove the ID. That's not a very useful property for us to look at here. We can reorder these if we'd like. Notice I have salary information in here that's not formatted. If I want to add formatting, if I click into the column here in the table, notice it says there's no rules defined. If you want to format the properties, you'll need to head over to the Ontology Manager. Let's take just a second and head over and show you how to do that. This might happen. While you're developing, you might realize, oh, I wish the data looked a little bit differently, and I'd like it to look differently throughout all of the ontology capable applications in Foundry, not just Workshop. We're going to do that in the Ontology Manager. So I can hit Control-J or Command-Shift-J if you're on a Mac, and we can look for Ontology Manager. We can give it a click. That will open the Ontology Manager. I'm going to jump into my employee object type, head to the Properties tab, click on Salary, and then click on Display in the right-hand sidebar. And I'm going to add some numeric formatting. I'm going to change the base type to currency. It's US dollars. And I'm also going to add grouping, which is going to place a comma in the thousands place. And we get a preview of what this looks like down below. It has a couple of decimal digits here, which I will never need. So I'm going to change the maximum fraction digits to 0, and that looks a lot better. I'll then click Save. And once this saves to the ontology, it should immediately be reflected throughout Foundry. Back over in my workshop module, indeed, that looks exactly like I'd expect. Okay, let's do a few more things to this table. First, what I want to enable is a selection not only of an individual row here, but I'd like to select multiple, and then I'd like the multiple selection to be reflected in a bar chart down below. Let's scroll down past the column configuration to the selection section. Now, the selected row here gets a generically named variable object, table1 active object. I'm going to click into that because I'd like to rename that to active employee. And I also want to enable multi-select. And then I'm going to name the variable that gets output when multiple employees are selected. New object set variable, it gives it a generic name. And I'm just going to call this selected employees. Now it's empty right now because nothing is selected, but if I click a few of these, I can see that the value of that variable, there's 3 objects of that type that have been selected in the table. So that looks like that's working as expected. A couple more things. I'm going to scroll to the very bottom and I'm going to add a couple of display and formatting settings here. I'm going to fit the columns horizontally, and I'll also enable narrow headers. And if I want to check in to see how that looks, I can save and publish, click View, and make sure that that's indeed what I'd expect. Also, we can check in on the filter, make sure it's working. It looks like it is. So we'll head back over to Edit Mode and configure the chart down below. I'll click Add Widget. We're looking for the XY chart. I'm going to click into the layer. This is where we define the data that goes into the chart. We'll define that as the selected employees. So our selection will be reflected in the chart. Now there's nothing in here. If I want to make a few selections, that will enable me to continue the configuration here in the layer. The property that I want to aggregate on essentially is going to be the country. Okay, and we have that displaying nicely here. So for example, if I wanted to see a chart of the countries of all the analysts, okay, I get them all displayed like this. So it's like all of our analysts are from France, China, or Canada. All right, I may want to do a little bit more styling in the chart. If I want, for example, if I click on the chart here, maybe I want to sort by the value descending. Incidentally, it was value descending, but maybe there's instances where that wouldn't have happened by default. So that's kind of how I would expect a histogram to look here. So that seems fine. I'm going to go ahead and save and publish. And for the moment, I'm not going to worry about the fact that if I don't have a selection, nothing appears in the chart, and that's kind of an eyesore, taking up a lot of real estate when we could be using it for something else. We're going to get at that a little bit later. Let's add our action button up at the top. What we'd like to do is to be able to select a row here and then be able to edit the record for that selected employee. So up in the upper right portion of that top section, I'm going to click a plus sign to add a widget, and the widget I'm going to add here is a button group. Let's rename that widget from button group to button group actions. And let's jump in to look at the button itself. Now I could give this a name, is just edit employee record. But one thing I'd like to do here is make it clear which employee I have selected. So we're actually going to do something a little bit different. For the title of the button, we're going to use a variable here. We're going to construct a variable that's going to concatenate edit record for and then the employee's name. So first, let's create a string variable that represents the active employee's name. I'll go to variables on the left, A new variable is going to be a string, and it's going to be an object property, a property on one object. We're going to call this active employee name. What is the object set we're going to start with? Well, it's the active employee, and the property that we want is going to be the name. Okay, so we see that as we select here, the name changes. It looks like that's working as expected. When we want to concatenate variables together, in addition to doing a lot of other things, we're going to use a variable transformation. To create a new variable, we'll click the plus button, string, and we're going to choose variable transformation. And let's name this our button label. The transform that we want to do is a string concatenation of, let's enter some text, update record for, and now we want to splice in our object property variable that we just created for our employee name. So let's hit the slash, gives us access to other variables that could potentially be placed in here, and it is our active employee name. So we can see update record for whoever we have selected here. I'm going to click the X in the upper right. I'm done configuring that variable transformation. I'm going to head back to my button, and I'm going to, instead of just having text here, I'm going to use a variable, namely the button label. Maybe a little bit more configuration on the button. I'd like to make this maybe an outline style. If I click into the button, we can set a color, maybe a warning. Maybe we want an edit icon here as well, kind of edit. And of course, now we need to actually wire this up to some kind of action. So in the button configuration, on click, instead of some event, we're going to have it trigger an action. Which action? Well, Workshop's pretty smart. It knows what object sets are in here and what actions are available on those object sets. And in our case, we have edit employee record. We need to tell it what is the record that we want to be editing here. And for that, we're going to set the parameter defaults. And we don't need to set the defaults for country name. We need to set what is the parameter we're going to be sending into this action from the Workshop module. And it is going to be some selected employee. And the variable that we're going to use is the active employee, or the employee that we have highlighted and whose name now appears in the variable transformed label for this button. So now that when I click, I have that employee, the country, the name, which I could edit. A few other things I could do here too, like come back to the action configuration. Maybe we'll have that employee name actually disabled so that we can't edit it here. The other thing I want to do is, if for some reason the security and submission criteria do not attain, I want the button to be hidden. So if it's invalid, we want to totally hide the button. We don't just want it disabled, we want it totally hidden. I'm going to hit save and publish. And before we turn to our conditional visibility, I'm going to add just a little bit more styling to make our module look nice. Left side of the screen, I'm going to head to the layout, which gives us access to our table of contents. And here I see I neglected to rename our chart widget here from chart XY1 to chart, and I'll call this employee country. And at this point, everything in my table of contents has a suitable name to it, the exception of the containing section on the right. I'm going to click on the page, and at the page level, I have access to some padding controls that will be applied to everything that is contained within this page. I'm going to change this from no padding to compact, okay? And I notice that that looks fine, but these sections on the right could stand to have a little padding applied in between them here. In order to do that, I'm going to click on the section that contains both of these sections. Oh, and I realize I should probably rename this from section to employee records. So with the containing section selected, I'm going to scroll down, find the padding controls, and I'm going to set a custom padding that places 20 pixels between these two. Now, if I mouse away, I see that there's still a border that exists in between these two, and I'd like to get rid of that. I'm going to go to the section containing the other two sections, and I'm going to make this a borderless section. So that looks a lot better. If I wanted to add a drop shadow behind, I could click each of these sections and add an outer drop shadow. And maybe I'll limit it at that. And that looks pretty nice. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to click Save and Publish. And now we're ready to talk about conditional visibility. Let's start with the fact that unless we make a selection in our table above, the chart down below doesn't render, and that takes up a lot of space. What we'd like to do is collapse this section unless there is a selection made in the table above. In order to apply conditional visibility to a section, we want to click the section in the module. We're going to scroll down. About halfway, we'll find an option to turn on conditional visibility. And as I do, notice that what it wants is a Boolean variable. I mentioned this at the beginning of this video that typically when we want to control the visibility of sections or widgets, we're going to need to do that through a Boolean variable. Here's a graphical representation of what we want to do. We want to create a Boolean variable using a variable transformation. We're doing a variable transformation because we want to evaluate other variables in order to generate a new variable. In this case, we're going to create a Boolean variable that's called graph visible, that's going to evaluate whether selected employees is or is not empty. And then we're going to plug that variable in to the section that we want to make conditionally visible. Let's make that Boolean variable by going up to the variables tab on the left side. We'll click new variable. What we want is a Boolean constructed using a variable transformation. Let's call this graph visible. And what we're going to do here, if I start typing the word object, I get some object set transformations here. I can evaluate individual properties. I can evaluate aggregations of properties, individual rids. What I'm going to choose here is empty. Okay, so what are we going to be evaluating? We're going to be evaluating selected employees. Selected employees is empty is currently set at true. Okay, so the value of this Boolean variable is currently true. So let's enable conditional visibility in this section. Hide this section if find our Boolean variable graph visible is true. We saw what happened in the back behind the window here. If I close that window, we can see this a little more expressly. Unless I make a selection, that section is now hidden. Okay, that works a lot better for us. Save and publish. We can try out a mini workflow here. Oh, I want to see the graph of the countries of all my developers. Okay, so that's conditional visibility condition 1. The next thing we want to make conditionally visible in this module is the salary column. I only want that information exposed to members of a particular admin group. I'm going to re-enter edit mode, click on my table, and to make columns conditionally visible, we'll scroll to the very bottom under the display and formatting section. And there's an option here to set variable-backed column visibility. If I flip this to the on position here, notice what it's expecting, a string array. It wants an array of column names. Now we want to make this dynamic based on who the user is. So let's look at a graphic about how we're going to build this. We're going to create a couple of variables that are based on variable transformations. We're going to create a string variable that represents the admin group ID. We will then create a string array variable that will represent all of the currently logged in users groups. And we're going to evaluate whether that admin group is in that string array. And then that will ultimately return a Boolean variable that determines if the user is an admin or not. What we'll then do is to create another string array variable that is a list of the visible columns. In order to generate that list, we're going to evaluate whether the user is an admin. If the user is an admin, we will return a series of admin columns that we will push into that string array variable visible columns. If the user is not an admin, they'll get a separate string array that will push into visible columns, and that's what we will provide into the table widget. So let's construct that user is admin Boolean variable. I've just pivoted back over to the settings where I have that group highlighted. You're not going to have this in your Foundry environment. Remember, we sort of talked about options if you don't have something available. Find a group you do have membership in. I'm going to grab the group ID and then head back into my workshop module. I'm simply going to use that to set a string variable, static, and we'll call this admin group ID. And I'm simply going to paste the value in as the default. Okay. What we now need is the set of users groups. To do that, we'll create a new variable. It is going to be an array, a string array, and it is going to be a multi-pass attribute. Multi-pass is Foundry's application for authentication and authorization. So we want some kind of user login attribute here. And it's group IDs. That's exactly the one that we want. And so we're going to call this users groups. So we now need a Boolean variable that evaluates whether that admin ID is in that users groups. We'll add a new variable. It will be a Boolean. It will be a variable transformation. And we're going to name this user is admin. Click add transform, and what we're looking for here, if I start typing the word contain, we get an array check option down here to check whether an array contains a certain value. So let's choose contains. So do the users groups contain any of the admin group ID? And in my case, I'm a member of that group, so that renders as true. That should for you as well if you chose a group that you're a member of. So we now have a way to evaluate whether the user is an admin. Now let's create our two string array variables that represent the columns that we want displayed based on who the user is. Before I get started, I'm going to click on the table that contains the columns. I'm going to scroll to the bottom and I'm going to turn on variable backed column visibility. When I do that, if I then scroll up to the column names themselves, I have a new hyperlink here that says show API names. My string array is going to be constructed not with the column names, but with the API names for the properties. Notice the API names then appear underneath. So let's create our two string array variables. New variable, string array, and we're going to have this be a static string array. And we're going to call this our admin columns. Now we'll have 4 columns for our admin user, and we need to literally type in the API names here. So what I have found, I'm on a Mac, but I've found if I can right click on the API name, I can copy and then paste directly in here. So I'll do those one by one. We'll grab the country, we'll grab the role, and then finally, because I'm an admin user, the salary. Close, and now let's create a string array representing our general columns. Now here we'll only have 3. We'll have our title, the country, and the role, but notably not the salary. Let's bring this all together in a string array variable created with a variable transformation that will evaluate, is the user an admin? If so, then take the admin columns and push that into the visible columns string array variable that we're about to create. New variable, this is going to be an array, a string array constructed with a variable transformation. And here we'll call this variable visible columns. The transform we're going to put in here is going to be an if-else statement. And we're going to output a string array. So here's the condition. If user is admin, then output admin columns, else output general columns. I'm an admin, so I see the salary property appears here. We'll close that. We'll come back to our table widget, scroll to the bottom, and we will now place the visible columns string array variable that we just constructed with a variable transformation into our table widget. Save and publish. Well, naturally, we want to know, did this work? I've created a notional user named Bob the user, who is not a member of that admin group. As you can see, I am logged in on this screen as Bob the user. I do not have that column visible. I still have the editor role on this resource though, so I can go in and I can evaluate. For example, if I find, let's find is user admin, the answer is false for me. This ID group is not in my list of user groups, and so the value of this is false. Therefore, I'm getting a different string array of column APIs exposed to me here. So far, so good. And of course, the rest of this is functioning as we configured earlier. The action button is not visible to me here. And why is that? That's because I set a submission criteria in the ontology manager that said, unless you belong to an admin group, you're not allowed to take this action. Furthermore, I configured that action button to be hidden if the button state is invalid, or in other words, if the security and submission criteria set in the ontology manager do not attain. So it's hidden from me here. I'm back logged in as admin in edit mode. I want to add one more condition on the visibility of this button, namely it has to be Friday. Let's just say for some reason I can only update employee records on Friday. We already have one condition set on the visibility of this action. We just talked about that. There's no way for Workshop to evaluate the day of the week. I can't evaluate the day of the week in the ontology manager. I can, however, write a TypeScript function that evaluates the day of the week. If it's Friday, it will return a true. If it's not Friday, it will return a false. So here's the graphic showing what we're about to do. We're going to write a function-backed Boolean variable. We're going to head over to a code repository. We'll author and publish our code, and we'll plug that into a Boolean variable simply called isItFriday. We will then plug that variable into our button conditional visibility. Okay, I'm back out at the root level of the project I've been building here, and I'm going to create a new folder in here called functions. Open that folder, and we're going to add a code repository. When we want to write a TypeScript or a Python function, we're going to create a code repository. Functions, I'm going to choose TypeScript, and I'm going to call this my employee record functions. Name there is not critical, but it just helps me distinguish it from other resources in my project here. Initialize repository. It's going to bootstrap this repository with everything it needs in order to write a TypeScript function. I'm going to expand all the files. I'm going to access the index.ts file that's in the source folder. And there's a lot of this that I can just go ahead and remove because I'm not going to be using any object inputs. I'm going to leave this top import statement. Really, all I need is function here imported from the functions API. And I'm going to delete most of this here. We'll leave just the skeleton outline here. And I'm just going to replace this function that's just called my function. We're going to call this isItFriday. And it's not going to take anything in, so we can remove the input there. And what we're going to output here instead of an integer, this is going to be a Boolean. Okay, let's construct this. So I'm going to remove this function definition in here, and we'll start afresh. Let's create constant variable just called today. And we're going to use the date method to construct that. That's not today. Call it today. All right. We'll head down. And what we want to do is we want to return a property on today that's just called getDay. And we want that, and that's the day of the week, by the way. We want that to be 5. The number 5 is going to represent Friday. And this is all that we need for our function here. Let's test this function by coming under the Functions tab. We'll find it in the live preview. Is it Friday? All we need to do is click Run. We have no inputs to provide here. And it's returning false because, again, unfortunately, it's not Friday. But that's what we want. We want a Boolean output here. Let's commit. And once the commit is done running, we will tag the version. Let's tag it with a minor version. Tag and release. So our continuous integration checks have to run. Once they run, the code's going to be available to use in Workshop. Okay, those checks have run. I'm ready to bring this into my Workshop module and wire it into a variable that I can use to control the visibility of my action button. Let's start by creating a new Boolean variable that is going to be function backed. And we'll call this Is It Friday? And we'll want to select a function to use. I have an it's Monday, or is it Friday? Let's choose Is It Friday? That's the function we just published. No function inputs. It's currently returning false. We'll close that out. We'll come up to our button. We'll click into the button that we want to configure. And we're going to turn on conditional visibility. Now, before I do that, I'm going to add a description in here that says admins can only update employee records on Friday. Now, when I mouse over, I can see, oh, admins can only update employee records on Friday. Set the conditional visibility. Our Boolean variable is going to be, is it Friday? And it's currently false. Now, we could either have this be disabled or we could have it be totally hidden. In this case, I think it probably makes sense to have it disabled. And now as an admin, I might wonder, why is this disabled? I mouse over and I'm told we can only update records on Friday. Save and publish. And let's head over to view mode to check out the entire thing. Let's select a couple of roles and we'll make a selection in the table. And our chart appears down below. Conditional visibility, condition number 1. Great. The other conditional visibility that we said here was on the visibility of this salary column. Now I'm an admin and I can see this. We saw when we logged in as Bob the user, that salary column was not available to us. Neither was the action button because we had hidden it using some logic in the Ontology Manager and in Workshop. Final thing we added was the condition that it must be Friday for this button to be clickable. And we added a description that describes why that's not visible to me right now. Admins can only update employee records on Friday. You're going to have to wait a few days, and then you can come in and actually click the button. Hope you had a good time building along with me today and that you feel comfortable using conditional visibility in multiple settings using multiple methods. It's a way to add some aesthetic, security, and other user experience features into your Workshop module. Hope to see you in a future Foundry video or a future Foundry training. Have a good day.